Hello, everyone. My name is Oksana Klimenko. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Ukrainian and Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. Now, I think we can wait for 2-3 minutes for other people, and then we'll start. Um, and maybe while we waiting for others, I can introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Henry Prown. Today he will deliver a lecture series which called the Holodomor as History and Heuristic. And I'm glad to introduce him, and I would like to tell a little bit about him. So Dr. Henry Prown is a 2020-2025 Tomerty postdoctoral fellow in Holodomor studies at the University of Alberta's Holodomor Research and Education Consortium and an instructor in the Department of History, Religion, and Classics. His area of specialization is the historical relationship between Stalinism and the American media during the Great Depression, with a particular focus on press coverage of Soviet atrocities viewed through a transnational lens. He graduated in May 2022 with a PhD in American Studies from William and Mary in Virginia. His dissertation, Famine, Trial, War, the Daily Worker During the Great Depression, won first place in the Estonian Institute of Historical Memories 2022 Research Papers Competition, and the manuscript based on its contents, Communist Propaganda in the Pre-Cold War America, has just been published by Bloomsbury as part of the Harvard Cold War Studies book series. He has also served as a contributing author and editor to the upcoming massive open online course on the Holodomor to be offered through the University of Alberta's Coursera e-learning platform, and is the author of a chapter in the upcoming Holodomor Global Perspective collection to be published by Ibiden Vertex this winter. Over the last 2 years, in addition to presenting findings at conferences at the University of Cambridge, the University of Montreal, and the University of Toronto, he has lectured at the Triennial Congress of Ukrainian Canadians and Edmonton's annual Holodomor Memorial. In his free time, Dr. Prown served on the board of directors CCILX, an Edmonton-based organization which offers English language learnings to refugees. Also, I would like to mention that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinabek, Ininewuk, Anisininewuk, Dakota Oyate, Denesulin, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So I think now I have introduced our today's speaker, and I think we can start. So please, Dr. Prown, welcome.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies here at the University of Manitoba for this kind invitation to speak this afternoon, as well as the organizers of this series, especially Dr. Oksana Klemenko, for that kind introduction and for her work in making this happen. 2 weeks ago, I had the privilege of giving the annual Ukrainian Famine lecture at the University of Toronto. And today I'm glad to have the opportunity to expand a little bit, share some of what I discussed then, but also expand a little bit on it through a more specific examination and explanation of my own research into media and atrocity. Pictured here is the Grand Toshogu Shrine. According to Atlas Escurica, this shrine was built in the small city of Nikko in central Japan and dedicated to a man named Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate, who was deified posthumously. Historically one of Japan's leading shrines, it is now recognized as a World Heritage Site and is known for its striking beauty. One of the buildings that form the complex is the Sacred Stable, which is adorned with an 8-panel sculpture attributed to Hidari Jingoru, a legendary sculptor whose existence is still a matter of debate. The sculpture depicts 8 stages of life enacted by monkeys. Its most notable panel is the Three Wise Monkeys, which depicts 3 Japanese macaques representing the principle of not seeing, or mizaru in Japanese, not hearing, or kikazaru, and not saying, or iwazaru. This particular relief was introduced to the Western world during the Meiji era in the late 19th century, leading to the coinage of the proverb, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And although the English phrase itself is relatively modern, the principle of see no evil is believed to date back to antiquity. For example, the Analects of Confucius, which was compiled during the Warring States period in China, has this saying, look not at what is contrary to propriety, listen not what is contrary to propriety, speak not what is contrary to propriety, make no movement which is contrary to propriety. At some point in time, somewhere in the 8th century, Buddhist monks brought the proverb to Japan. It was eventually translated to that Mizaru, Kikazaru, Iwazaru, meaning see not, hear not, say not. And this is, you might say, the kind of broader theme of my talk today, which deals precisely with this question of how we remember famine and mass atrocity, how we forget them, and how we deny them. Indeed, is the story of how we develop vast and varied ecosystems of denial to engineer and enable acts of mass atrocity, famine, and genocide. Around this time last fall, a curious article appeared in the Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda, with the following headline. A monument to the victims of the Holodomor was discovered in the Kherson village of Novomayachka. And the authors of this piece in Pravda noted with evident concern that the monument still stands. And this is despite the fact that, according to these authors, the region became part of Russia 2 years ago. Following a campaign of destruction the prior November, over a dozen such memorials had been demolished throughout that oblast alone, and evidently the journalists had assumed that none remained. And the timing of these November campaigns were likely not coincidental, given that Ukrainian people across the world, from the mud-filled trenches of the Donbass to the hollowed halls of Canada's corridors of power, set aside the 23rd of November to remember a tragedy and a crime that many would rather be forgotten. The forced mass starvation of millions of Ukrainians in the early 1930s by the Stalinist regime, along with the mass persecution of Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, artists, religious leaders, and political cadres that is now widely known as the Holodomor, or alternatively, the so-called Holodomor, as the Russian government terms it. To return to that Pravda article on the final remaining Holodomor monument in southern Ukraine, it suggested that let us recall that the topic of the quote-unquote Holodomor is part of anti-Russian propaganda, while in reality, according to the authors, many regions of the USSR were starving in those years. And you might assume it were a fair point, though one is then forced to wonder why Russian occupying authorities are not just destroying Holodomor memorials, but also monuments to victims of Stalinist repression more generally, for instance in Luhansk this July, or why these are being replaced by busts of the mustachioed dictator himself in occupied cities like Melitopol. Moreover, one must ask why this 1930s era starvation seemed to hit certain regions of the vast Soviet Empire with particular severity. Why, according to recent demographic studies, like you see on the screen here, upwards of 9 times as many Ukrainians perished as Russians. You must ask why the overwhelmingly Russian oblast on the northern borders of Ukraine experienced very little starvation, and why the oblasts to the east, with large Ukrainian populations, experienced a great deal. We must ask what precisely Joseph Stalin had meant in the summer of 1932 when he told his top Russian officials, in the face of reports of famine from his own top Ukrainian officials, to give the most serious attention to the Ukraine, isolate the whining, and ensure genuinely Bolshevik decisions. What those decisions were: a ratcheting up of the forced requisition campaign, the ration blacklisting of entire villages and districts, and a military-style blockade of Ukraine as a whole, are a matter of historical record. Soviet dissident Lev Kopelev, one of the so-called 25,000ers sent into those farming communities to deprive already starving Ukrainian peasants of their last morsels that winter of 1932 to 1933, recalled the following: "I took part in this process myself, scouring the countryside, searching for hidden grain, testing the earth with an iron rod for loose spots that might lead to buried grain. With the others, I emptied out the old folks' storage chests, stopping my ears to the children's crying and the women's wails, for I was convinced that I was accomplishing the great and necessary transformation of the countryside." And that word transformation is it's an interesting word to be used in this context. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who invented the concept of genocide during the Second World War, cogently observed that such transformation was an essential part of the Soviet program for expansion, for it offers the quick way of bringing unity out of the diversity of cultures and nations that constitute the Soviet Empire. And Lemkin shared these thoughts during a 1953 commemoration in New York on the 20th anniversary of the Holodomor, in a speech on what he described as perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. And I think it's important to point out that this attempted destruction is self-evidently an ongoing process, which both predated the Soviet experiment and now postdates it. Thus, the 1932-33 famine, as Lemkin himself clarified, was merely an especially horrifying part of this genocidal whole, with the weapon used against the farmers being perhaps the most terrible of all, in his estimation: starvation. Yet, he added later on in this speech, there has been an attempt to dismiss this high point of Soviet cruelty. This attempted dismissal, as it played out in Western media and politics, and the central role of the Communist International in Moscow and its satellite parties abroad in promoting such denialism to Western audiences, even as Ukrainians were still starving, rests at the heart of my own research. Indeed, it forms a constitutive part of my new monograph with Bloomsbury Press, Communist Propaganda in Pre-Cold War America, which is a history of the American Communist Party's official newspaper, a paper called The Daily Worker. But before we discuss communist media, I'd like to begin with a story of capitalist opportunity. During the summer of 1930, in the midst of the Great Depression, a group of well-heeled American business executives gathered for an evening of fine dining at the exquisite Hotel Savoy in central Moscow. Representing the Great Northern Railway, see an example here, they had been invited to the Soviet Union to help develop its transportation network, part of the Stalinist regime's ambitious 5-year plan to modernize the nation's industrial base. Great Northern Railway would not be the only Western corporation to participate in this highly publicized drive, with the scholar Thomas Hughes noting that the cream of American firms were eager to sell their state-of-the-art to the Reds. But Great Northern Railway was among the earliest, and one of the attendees that night was the firm's president, Ralph Budd, giving you an idea of how important this contract was. You see him pictured here, as well as his unassuming secretary, Homer B. Bassett. Bassett laconically recalled in his unpublished diaries that they had a, quote, fairly good meal, and even the opportunity to meet famed New York Times Moscow correspondent Walter Duranty. The British-born Duranty, you see him in the center here, who went on to win a a Pulitzer Prize rather in 1932 for his coverage of the Soviet Union, was one of the most celebrated journalists of his time, his presence at public events occasionally provoking prolonged pandemonium among adoring and often very influential fans, including incoming President Roosevelt. And the prominent American publication The Nation would praise his Soviet reporting as enlightening and dispassionate, while the main American communist newspaper would offer similar praise, noting that he has done more than any other American journalist to promote understanding between the peoples of the U.S. and the USSR. That understanding was grounded in a positive and optimistic vision of the Stalinist regime and its policies, with Duranty even optimistically suggesting in 1931 that millions of Westerners would emigrate to the communist East due to the success so far of the five-year plan and the distress in capitalist countries. Nor was he alone in his suggestions, with the famous author George Bernard Shaw more directly telling young Americans that same year to go to Russia and settle there. And while the numbers never matched Duranty's projections or Shaw's wishes, thousands did take the gamble and suffer greatly for it in the ensuing years of violence, chaos, and terror. But in the early 1930s, it seemed to many foreign dignitaries as if the USSR was a land of hope, to quote Shaw. The American railway employee Bassett's initial impression of this communist land was similarly somewhat positive. However, his impression soon soured in the face of a terrific shortage of supplies, and by the time his party left the comforts of Moscow, his feelings had begun to change. He soon beheld with horror what he called one of the most tragic sights we have ever witnessed: peasants locked up in prison cars like so many cattle. The wretched farmers overseen by eagle-eyed secret police, and the peasants locked up in these cattle cars he encountered throughout the otherwise bucolic Soviet countryside were the early products of a process known as collectivization, the autocrat Joseph Stalin's then ongoing effort to assume state control of private agriculture in order to fund his concurrent industrialization drive. And as we now know, the consequences of this effort would prove devastating for his own citizens, millions of whom would perish in those years in this pursuit of total economic and administrative power. Yet, despite committing what many governments and international organizations today recognize as genocide, the Stalinist regime faced almost no external consequences at the time, political or otherwise. In fact, the US officially recognized the Soviet Union in the winter of 1933, and soon afterwards the League of Nations adopted a resolution inviting the communist state to join its ranks, legitimizing the Stalinist regime's brutal rule before the international community. And why the West failed to act or prevent or alleviate mass starvation in Soviet Ukraine is, in my estimation, at the core of studying this particular atrocity and potentially offers lessons for other historical and contemporary events. It also serves as the subject of my contribution to an upcoming massive open online course available through the Coursera platform on the Holodomor, which has brought together more than a dozen leading scholars on the famine to produce a first of its kind free undergraduate level offering through the University of Alberta. And I want to just play a brief clip from the module that I wrote.
In this module, we'll explore to what extent the international community, particularly in Europe and North America, was aware of the Holodomor in Ukraine during the early 1930s. We'll examine efforts by the media, governments, and private organizations to cover and cover up the tragedy. And we'll demonstrate that previous assumptions that the Holodomor was a hidden famine are misleading. In fact, there was widespread awareness among powerful state and non-state actors, even those who publicly denied it was happening. Examining these narrative battles offers us a greater understanding of contemporary discussions about misinformation, propaganda, and mass atrocity.
Indeed, as the narrator of that clip notes, while it's often believed that few at the time really knew about mass starvation in Ukraine, with commenters sometimes referring to it as a hidden famine, recent scholarship has shown that foreign journalists, governments, and aid organizations were actually very well informed about the Holodomor as it was happening. And their oft-critiqued lack of action grew not necessarily out of a lack of knowledge, but rather out of a series of political considerations that led to what the Moscow correspondent Eugene Lyons contemporaneously described as a conspiracy of silence. As the early scholar of Stalinism and the Holodomor, Robert Conquest, would corroboratively note in the first major English language history of the tragedy, deception was practiced on a giant scale. In particular, every effort was made to persuade the West that no famine was taking place, and later that none had in fact taken place. Stalin knew that even though the truth may be readily available, the deceiver need not give up. He saw that flat denial on the one hand and the injection into the pool of information of a corpus of positive falsehood on the other was sufficient to confuse the issue. Conquest words, though referencing past events, will no doubt strike contemporary readers and listeners as particularly timely and relevant given our current media landscape. While these phenomena are sometimes seen as kind of postmodern inventions of the social media age that oft critiqued menace of fake news, the history of the Holodomor demonstrates that they actually have strong historical roots in print-based mass media, and specifically in this case in the ideological and informational battles of the early 1930s. Responding to a growing number of credible reports of famine in the Soviet Union in 1933, the New York Times' Walter Duranty notoriously penned articles like "Russians hungry, but not starving," even as he told British diplomats confidentially that he thought it quite possible that as many as 10 million people may have died across the Soviet Union. And indeed, as I'm finding out, just as an aside in my own current research on the State Department and their internal documentation, Duranty was also informing the State Department of these affairs privately as well. But this effort of Duranty and his colleagues in the mainstream press to downplay the Holodomor and the counter efforts of whistleblowers to expose its horrors can provide a fuller explanation of exactly what Eugene Lyons had meant when he described the world's response to the Holodomor, specifically the journalistic response to the Holodomor, as a conspiracy of silence. When the Great Northern Railway's Homer Bassett returned to Moscow after his revealing trip through the suffering Soviet countryside in the summer of 1930, he tried to make sense of the troubling sights he had witnessed by interrogating the city's American expats. We were told that the reason for the food shortage is because the Soviet government tried to force the peasants in the collective farms, Bassett recalled after a dinner with Walter Duranty's counterpart at the Christian Science Monitor, a man named William H. Chamberlain. And publicly, Chamberlain had been kind of a supporter and booster of the Soviets, although privately he and his Russian-born wife, Sonia, would tell guests that this was because they have to be extremely careful what they say to anyone. So when these food shortages developed into widespread famine 2 years later, Chamberlain largely held his tongue, at least until he returned to the U.S., where he wrote that during the winter of 1932 and the spring of 1933, stark famine stalked through great areas of Ukraine and the North Caucasus. This is from a book called Russia's Iron Age, written in 1934. He claimed that it levied a death toll of 10% on a population of 50 or 60 millions. But he also added that according to the Stalinist regime, the famine did not occur. And Soviet state was not alone, of course, in denying what we now call the Holodomor, though with Chamberlain's counterpart at the Nation, just to give another example, Louis Fisher, as well as the aforementioned Walter Duranty being kind of some of the more well-known examples of well-respected foreign correspondents downplaying or covering up the famine. However, in the case of journalists like Fisher, Chamberlain, and Duranty, all of whom were ostensibly unaffiliated with the Bolshevik movement and all of whom had extensively traveled in Ukraine in 1932 to 1933, the motivation for their public disavowals was not necessarily strictly ideological, but also professional. As well-paid and highly respected correspondents for legacy media outlets in the U.S., they had very good reason to avoid angering the Soviet government with their reporting, as ultimately they depended on that government's good graces for residency and for access. In 1937, Chamberlain himself would admit that his coverage from those years suffered somewhat from the self-imposed censorship dictated by the desire to remain in the Soviet Union. Eugene Lyons, who was then reporting for United Press in the Soviet Union, more bluntly explained that the taboos of a powerful government in an angry know-nothing mood are not broken lightly by resident newspapermen who have jobs to protect and families to feed. Circumstances were not necessarily much different in the Moscow offices of other Western countries. As the French historian Etienne Thevenin has observed, no French reporter thought of venturing into Ukraine during the months of the famine. As for resident French journalists or those reporting from Moscow, they hesitated to give a report on the alarming noises which they heard. Coverage of the famine did occasionally prove more frank in German, Austrian, and Polish media, though a series of geopolitical considerations would lead to even avowedly anti-communist autocratic governments remaining relatively silent. Yet, if many career-minded reporters refused to let themselves be sidetracked by moral issues, as Durante frankly confessed in 1935, others felt obliged, despite the professional risks and the skepticism of their peers, to tell the world what they saw. The most well-known among them today is, of course, Gareth Jones, whose spring 1933 journey through the Ukrainian countryside and subsequent sensational revelations of famine to the Western press served as the plot to the 2019 film Mr. Jones. However, he was not alone, and among the more obscure and yet equally revelatory whistleblowers was a young Canadian woman named Rhea Kleiman, as recounted in illuminating detail by the scholar Yars Balan in his 2017 contribution to the annual famine lecture in Toronto. Born in the Jewish Pale of Settlement at the turn of the century, Kleiman had moved to Toronto as a young girl, where she lost part of her leg after being struck by a streetcar. Growing up in poverty, Kleiman would develop strong egalitarian sensibilities and come, like so many of her peers, to believe that the Soviet Union offered an alternative, progressive, and realistic vision of the future. She also had an adventurous streak, and so in 1928, at the age of 24, she spontaneously moved to Moscow with just 15 pounds in her pocket and a firm resolve to become a foreign correspondent. And despite lacking credentials or connections, she managed to earn a modest living as a freelancer and a tour guide for foreign notables, including the aforementioned George Bernard Shaw. However, by the early 1930s, Kleiman had herself become resolutely disabused of her previous optimism regarding the great Soviet experiment. Before long, Kleiman would make her dissatisfaction known publicly in a series of articles for the Canadian magazine Maclean, published in May and June of 1932, writing that the Bolshevik leadership has become an ossified elite that refused to recognize the failure of so many of their ideologically driven policies. Perhaps knowing that she would soon be expelled for her critical reportage, she also undertook a pair of remarkable journeys that summer through the Soviet countryside, first northwards to Arkhangelsk in Russia, and then southwards to Tbilisi in Georgia, traveling over 2,500 miles across rugged and remote terrain. It was on this second journey south, taken under the ostensible auspices of a guided tour for two young and affluent American women, that she entered into Ukraine, just prior to the closure of its borders. And Kleiman's choice of route was clearly intentional. She had heard terrible stories of ongoing starvation in Ukraine. When I left Moscow, I knew there was famine raging there, she later recalled, and what she found on her travels confirmed these stories. We had been 2 days in Kharkov, but we were all anxious to get away. The great Ukrainian capital was in the grip of hunger. Beggars swarmed round the streets. The stores were empty. Of course, at the time, Kharkiv was the capital of Soviet Ukraine. The villages were strangely forlorn and deserted. I could not understand at first. The houses were empty, the doors flung wide open, the roofs were caving in. I felt that we were following in the wake of some hungry horde that was sweeping on ahead of us and laying all the homes bare. Tell the Kremlin we are starving, we have no bread, we are good, hard-working peasants, loyal Soviet citizens, but the village has taken our land from us. Indeed, in that famished village of Sumka, a tall, gaunt woman had insisted on demonstratively showing Kleiman what was happening to her own slowly dying children. She prodded their sagging bellies, pointed to their spindly legs, ran her hand up and down their tortured, misshapen, twisted little bodies to make me understand that this was a real famine. I shut my eyes, Kleiman explained. I could not bear to look at all this horror. But unlike other, more respected and better paid foreign correspondents, she did actually force herself to look at the unfolding horror, and left this village with the determination that their petition should not only be heard in the Kremlin, but by the rest of the world also. Stalin was building socialism in one country, and peasant children were eating grass outside the doors of his socialist cities. And she kept her promise to the fullest, after having been expectedly and unceremoniously expelled from the USSR upon her arrival in Tbilisi in Georgia, she went on to pen over 40 articles in various Canadian newspapers describing the situation then prevailing in the same regions where American journalists like Louis Fisher had claimed that there is no starvation. And though the worldly rewards for her truth-telling, beyond an initial interest displayed by some Toronto newspapers, were quite minor, the historian Yars Balan recalled that after a relatively short journalistic career, which included a stint as the Daily Telegraph's Munich correspondent during the early years of the Nazi regime, where she would miraculously survive a plane crash, she gradually faded into obscurity while struggling to make ends meet at a variety of jobs for which she was often ill-suited given her intellect and abilities. In fact, Balan added, her remarkable and brave reporting had become so forgotten that when she died in New York City in 1981, at the age of 77, her passing was not recorded. And in this regard, her experience was not unique. As we shall see soon, other Holodomor whistleblowers, like the Jewish Daily Forward's Harry Lang, found little public plaudits and, in his case, a lot of public hostility in response to their reporting. Meanwhile, their counterpart Walter Duranty would, as mentioned, win a Pulitzer Prize for his Soviet reporting, and Louis Fisher would have a distinguished career as a reporter, novelist, and professor at Princeton University. Monetary gain came hand over fist with denial, downplaying, and deflection in the face of mass atrocity. Yet to focus purely on these material aspects may be to miss something crucial, for what seemed to drive whistleblowing journalists like Kleiman were not professional rewards so much as professional duties and a sense of moral obligation. In fact, in one of her few recorded interviews for the Globe and Mail in 1939, she recalled being asked by a doctor after her devastating car accident at the age of 6, "Young lady, what are you going to be when you grow up?" I said I was going to be a journalist, she remembered, and I stuck to it. That's all. And that she did, and in doing so, I would argue she distinguished herself, if not to her peers, then at least to those students of history and observers of contemporary events who now, almost a century later, find lasting and timeless value in her work. But while Western media outlets had their own eyes and ears of varying forthcomingness on the ground in the Soviet Union, the Soviet government itself maintained a network of advocates and operatives abroad who simultaneously worked to blind foreigners to the harsher realities of Soviet life. This network centered around an ostensibly independent Moscow-based political organization called the Communist International, or Comintern, which by the early 1930s, to quote the scholars Kevin McDermott and Jeremy Agnew, was kept in existence primarily as a propaganda weapon for the first socialist state, its dual purpose being to trumpet abroad the successes of the five-year plans and to rally the international working class to the defense of the Soviet Union. And in order to understand how such a weapon was wielded to cover up the Holodomor, we might consider the specific case of this organization's American affiliate, the Communist Party of the United States, or CPUSA, which under the Comintern's direction diligently defended the Stalinist regime's increasingly autocratic actions before an often admittedly skeptical U.S. public. This defense could be bolstered, Moscow officials would instruct their communist counterparts in New York during the fall of 1931, by using party media to argue that in the richest land on earth there is the greatest poverty among the unemployed, and to denounce the policy of the American government and the American capitalists by pointing to the example of the Soviet Union. And the Comintern's leadership would often very helpfully, as you can see here, capitalize the important parts of the sentence just to drive the point home. The example of the Soviet Union. Indeed, in the early 1930s, the CPUSA, through its media outlets, desperately sounded the alarm. Party propaganda outlets repeatedly warned that a horrific famine had struck the nation, impacting hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. It was, their journalists accusatorily claimed, murder of the people by a government. Each day, more than 1,000 drop away, another article argued. It is famine, a famine in the midst of plenty. Will it continue to cannibalism? The party's principal paper, The Daily Worker, wondered morbidly. But according to these dedicated communists, Americans did have a way out, the way of Soviet Russia. The Soviet counterpart always loomed large in this coverage. As the CPUSA's leader, Earl Browder, would explain at a national convention in 1934, clearly the world is divided into two systems moving in opposite directions. These words were not necessarily his, however. A few weeks earlier, Browder had received direct and detailed instructions from the Comintern in Moscow to, quote, contrast the world of dying capitalism to the world of victorious socialism in his speech's introduction, which he dutifully did. During these troubled years, the Comintern regularly relayed such orders to their devoted comrades in New York, repeatedly telling them to damn the American government's failures and celebrate the Soviet state's successes, including its unprecedented agricultural collectivization campaign. Yet all was not necessarily well in this imagined triumphal world of victorious socialism. In the spring of 1933, as we've already talked about, these sensational firsthand reports from a number of different sources began arriving in the English-speaking press, indicating that the USSR, and in particular Ukraine, had itself been struck by famine on a colossal scale, to quote one report. Responding quickly to the resulting public relations crisis this story engendered, Comintern officials in Moscow told the CPUSA's leadership that it was necessary to conduct extensive and most concrete but capable propaganda of the successes of collectivization in agriculture in the USSR. This is from May 1933. Specifically, the party needed to explain to the American people that the collective farm system was necessary and superior, that collectivization took place voluntarily, and that in the USA, in a nod to maybe what was happening in the Soviet Union, in the USA, the collectivization of farming can be realized with less difficulty. Daily worker correspondents reporting out of Kyiv and Kharkiv would do just that, penning articles like Ukraine collectives have best harvest in 30 years, and debt-free farmers of Ukraine get large excess of cash and grain, while assuring their readers that any stories of starvation were simply odious lies and slander, which a certain section of the bourgeois press, following the example of the German fascists, are spreading about the Soviet collective farming districts, particularly in the Ukraine. And curiously enough, it would be a Yiddish language publication with a decidedly socialist bent called the Jewish Daily Forward that would draw much of their ire in this regard. The Forward spits hatred at the USSR, read one typical Daily Worker headline from that December, in which the authors complained that the Forward was mouthing every rotten slander about famine in the Ukraine, repeating every lie that was coming out of the Vatican, popes, and bishops, out of the publicity machines of the Hitler government. Situated directly to the right, on the same page of the December 26, 1933 piece condemning the Jewish Daily Forward for mouthing every rotten slander about famine, was a corresponding report from the Daily Worker's new man in Moscow named Vern Smith, in which he set out to discredit what he called the editorials now being printed in the socialist Jewish Daily Forward regarding the, quote, slavery in one of the largest parts of the Soviet Union. And Smith referred here not to Ukraine, but to the recently founded steel city of Magnitogorsk in Russia, which had been the subject of extensive praise in the paper and apparently harsh criticism in more skeptical press outlets. And recalling kind of the project's disturbing history in 2016, an essayist in The Guardian noted that many of these workers were essentially dispossessed Tatars from the Chelyabinsk region who'd been forcibly moved here to construct this city. Meanwhile, this essayist noted, party officials enjoyed a comparatively luxurious life in the wooded American town that was built originally for specialists from the US in 1930. And in fact, the Daily Worker article, or rather, Vern Smith in his Daily Worker article actually dwelled at length about this luxurious American town, which he himself had visited, describing in excruciating detail a banquet that started with bread and cheese and smoked sturgeon, wandered through soup and roast meat, and ended with cookies, tea, and apples. Held, the reader was told, in a beautiful dining room with indirect lighting at flower-covered tables. Conversely, the kind of dispossessed Tatars living in open-air concentration camps seem to have escaped his notice, at least in this official report. Meanwhile, the editorial on the left of the rotten slander invective against the Jewish Daily Forward focused by comparison on labor practices in the U.S., decrying the perpetuation of capitalist slavery at the expense of the great masses of toilers. Its title, at once exceedingly ironic and at the same time unintentionally appropriate, was Gushing Hypocrisy. And the attentive observer will note that in this case, the word slavery lacked the scare quotes found in Smith's Apologia for Magnitogorsk. Indeed, this selective scare quoting can be seen throughout the Daily Worker's reporting, with, for instance, the Holodomor being described as a quote-unquote famine, and fictional mass starvation in the U.S., by contrast, being simply labeled as famine. Such word games were additionally used to demean leftist rivals. You can see here draft articles contained in the Communist Party journalist Sam Darcy's personal files indicate that the editors themselves would insert qualifiers like misnamed or so-called when the writers mentioned the Socialist Party without the required pejoratives. Interestingly, this practice is also evident in the CPUSA's internal communications with Comintern superiors. For instance, in one memo to Moscow from the party's Agitprop Committee on the principal newspapers and publications read by the masses in the USA, the Jewish Daily Forward would be described as an extremely right-wing, quote-unquote, socialist daily. Nonetheless, the memo's authors would very tellingly admit that the paper was actually the largest Jewish daily in the world, with 118,000 daily circulation, well more than double that of the CPUSA's own central organ, the Daily Worker, which usually hovered around 40 or 50,000 at this time. Prepared in 1937, this report indicated a lasting communist interest, both domestically and internationally, in non-communist Jewish media. So we have already seen this interest was most visible in the party's press, which indicted the Jewish Daily Forward staff in particular, not only as pretend socialists, but ultimately as open reactionaries who had been preparing the ground for fascism and anti-Semitism in this country and had consciously distorted every Soviet decree and events in the USSR. These indictments, and that is the word that the Daily Worker's editors used, had been specifically prompted by the Jewish Daily Forward's prior coverage of the famine in Ukraine. As a self-retrospective prepared in 2022 to mark the outlet's 125th anniversary explained, this coverage had become a primary source of American information on the Holodomor, especially after some of labor editor Harry Lang's material was reprinted in English from the original Yiddish in the New York Evening Journal, a conservative media mogul William Randolph Hearst newspaper, in the year 1935. So this is kind of 2 years after the peak of the famine. Lang's now celebrated stories would then prove deeply and devastatingly controversial for this very reason, and not merely among kind of CPUSA party apparatchiks. On April 17, 1935, the Daily Worker's front page led with an extraordinary series of pro-Soviet testimonials from a number of prominent socialists and liberals who claimed to have visited the Soviet Union themselves, testimonials solicited by the editors in response to the New York Evening Journal's translation and republication of Lang's slanderous anti-Soviet articles, which had begun 2 days earlier. These slanderous articles recounted a trip he had taken in mid-1932 with his wife Lucy Robbins Lang through the famished villages outside Kiev and the Kharkov zone of Russia, as he termed it, where we were shaken by the scenes of famine. Fittingly, Kharkiv was also the city from which the Daily Worker's own foreign correspondent, Nathaniel Buchwald, would proudly proclaim that same summer that farmers of Ukraine get large excess of cash and grain, part of a series of reports from the winter of 1932 onwards in which he would testify on the basis of personal observation. Let me repeat that, testify on the basis of personal observation in the Crimea and the Ukraine to the spirit of optimism prevailing among the peasants in the collective farms. Harry Lang, having himself gone down to the Ukraine and saw with my own eyes the destruction wrought there, the wreckage of a great country, and having brought these observations to the attention of the American public through popular English language media, was thus directly and dangerously undermining the CPUSA's own triumphalist narratives about the glories of Soviet agriculture. and that these informed claims of mass starvation from an otherwise sympathetic socialist really did pose a threat to this Comintern ordered party propaganda of the successes of collectivization, to use their own words, was made especially obvious by the Daily Worker's editors so quickly turning to their most prominent non-communist readers for public support in ruining Lang's reputation and career. As I've recounted in lectures on Holodomor denial in the American Communist Press, the curious collection of contributors to this piece included the author J.W. Wise, who branded Lang a pen prostitute printing starvation slanders, the activist Margaret Lamont, who cited the reports of Louis Fisher, Walter Duranty, and other competent observers of the situation in Russia as proof that Lang's lurid story had no merit, the socialist and trade unionist Powers Hapgood, who dismissed Lang's writings as ridiculously melodramatic and suggested that his long delay publishing articles proves of financial interest, Der Tag manager and Brooklyn Daily Eagle columnist B.Z. Goldberg, who actually did admit that there was a famine in Ukraine, and he ran into trouble from the Daily Worker's editors for doing this, actually. But he blamed the peasants for sabotaging the collectivization program and asserted that now, in 1935, there was plenty of food. And most surprisingly of all among these contributors, the well-respected theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who censured Lang for supposedly accepting the Hearst propaganda in regard to Russian starvation. And jointly they had levied an accusation of journalistic indiscretion with which readers then and now would be all too familiar. Basically, Lang was promoting fake news, and his supposed tissue of lies was made all the more despicable because it comes from a socialist writer that had the indecency to sell himself to Hearst, whose New York Evening Journal did possess a justifiably mixed record, including in its coverage of the Holodomor. On March 5th, 1935, the nation's Louis Fisher had exposed the paper for relying on misattributed and misdated photos purportedly of famine in Ukraine from a fabulist going by the name Thomas Walker. And this highly publicized editorial error and the enduringly controversial figure of Hearst himself would be utilized to great effect by Soviet sympathizers to dismiss the entirety of the New York Evening Journal's extensive reporting on the issue. As Lucy Robbins Lang, pictured here, bitterly recalled in 1948, my husband, Harry, was held responsible for all the ideas that William Randolph Hearst had ever expressed. Nor, she added more disturbingly, was the campaign limited to mudslinging. For these initial attacks in the Daily Worker would be followed up with a fierce and sustained campaign of harassment that traumatized the couple. Hell broke loose, she explained, asserting that they were repeatedly subject to not only vile slanders, but also threats from American communists and even intimidation from the OGPU, the Soviet secret police, which intimated through intermediary means that their extended families still living in Russia and Ukraine would be targeted for persecution. And that her assertions, at least in the former case, were not entirely unfounded, can be verified through a cursory examination of the Daily Worker's issues from the last 2 weeks of April 1935 alone. This campaign would continue for months and months, but just to take those last 2 weeks, there's well over dozens of articles condemning Lang as variously a prostitute, a liar, a traitor, and a fascist. The editors would go beyond these insulting repudiations for his supposed adaptation of all of Hearst's lies about starvation in the Soviet Union, however, printing angry letters from readers asserting that there is no punishment too severe for so vile a beast as the so-called socialist Harry Lang. Sorry, I've got this all out of order. You see those in the background there. So basically, this person is calling him a vile beast. There's no punishment too severe for him. Another one warned him to stay away from this picket line, implying he'd be beat up if he showed at the picket line. What you see on screen here is Lucy Lang's recollection that essentially after this, Harry had to be escorted to his office by friends in the Garment Workers Union. As evidenced by the April 17th testimonials, the communists were not alone in their censures of Lang. Soon sympathetic local branches and national officials of the Socialist Party, its affiliated labor unions and media, were calling for the expulsion of Harry Lang from the Socialist Party. Its National Secretary Clarence Sr. declared that Lang had placed himself beneath contempt and repudiated his slander of Soviet Russia, what he called deliberate attempts to bring both fascism and war to the United States. And though these condemnations were often solicited by and invariably printed in the Daily Worker, the communist newspaper, their rapidity in arriving, their vitriolic content, and their sheer number, again, there are a lot of these articles, hundreds potentially, throughout 1935, indicated that these feelings were strong and widespread across the American left. Indeed, the CPUSA's own archives offer evidence of this. They had informants going to these Socialist Party conventions where the socialists were debating whether to expel Lang from the party. Here, the mention kind of this trend. There's an important resolution which indicated the trend of this convention. This is the resolution which demands the expulsion of Lang, who wrote the articles in the Hearst papers, from the SP, Socialist Party. They expressed dissatisfaction with the committee in New York, which had only suspended him for a year at this point, and they demanded his expulsion from the party. And this trend that they're referring to reflected kind of the Socialist Party's internal struggle between the left wing and the old guard, as Max Schachtman put it, which would lead to a split the following year, and most of the old guard, including the Jewish Daily Forward and its staff, joining the new Social Democratic Federation. The CPUSA had deftly leveraged these growing divides by portraying the republication of Lang's Holodomor whistleblowing in the New York Evening Journal as an alliance with Hearst against the Soviet Union in order to convince the predominantly pro-Soviet elements within the Socialist Party to join with the communists. And in this effort, they were clearly somewhat successful, for while it is true that a long hoped for merger of the two largest communist parties, or Marxist parties rather, in the US never actually materialized, many within them had undoubtedly found common ground in a shared desire to guard against capitalist attacks on the Soviet Union, as the Socialist Party's national secretary aptly put it. Thus, by May 13th, even its embattled leader, Norman Thomas, was willing to go on record as in favor of expelling Harry Lang from the Socialist Party and reprimanding the Daily Forward. Additionally, aided by eminent public personalities like Union Theological Seminary professor and the supreme theologian of the 20th century, as the New York Times referred to him, Reinhold Niebuhr, who called Lang's actions despicable, American Newspaper Guild president and noted columnist Hayward Broun, who told readers that in every phrase and line, they, meaning the Lang articles, carry the smell of being phony, and Louis Fisher's fellow contributor at The Nation and one of the most prominent American journalists to focus on labor, Benjamin Stolberg, who accused Lang of telling lies about the Soviet Union and the Hearst press. Collectively, the CPUSA seems to have been able to convince many well-wishers on the left not merely that reports of a Ukrainian famine were an exaggeration, as the New York Times' Walter Duranty would infamously insist that summer of 1933, but that, to quote the Daily Worker's Michael Gold in 1935, they were nothing more than the Hearsts and Chamberlains repeating their Nazi-inspired lies. You see the inclusion of Chamberlain here because he published that book the previous year. And it was out of this collective damnation of Harry Lang, this common cause for the defense of the land of socialism, the Soviet Union, that a united front has been forged, the paper's editors proudly declared. And thus the origins of that fondly remembered Depression era coming together of progressive forces, which we now refer to as the Popular Front, may partially lie in a long obscured collaboration to deny the Holodomor in service of the Stalinist regime. And I've got about 30 more slides, probably another 20 minutes of material, but I'll cut it there because I know I'm running up against that hour. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. And now we have time for questions, please. Okay, we can wait for some questions. I have two questions, and I will use this opportunity to ask you. You mentioned about Russian media now, Russian fakes about Holodomor. So after the Russian full-scale invasion in 2022, Russian media, what's going on in Russian media, I mean, about Holodomor? Did they mention something, or what did they say about it, or just nothing? First question. And next, in newspapers which were published in Winnipeg by Ukrainian Labor Temple 1930s, I found such style type of publication which called letters from the Soviet Union, and in these letters it was written that everything great in Soviet Union, no famine, nothing. In Daily Worker or in other American newspapers, did these newspapers include such publications like letters from Soviet Union or nothing?
I mean, this is the thing. It's hard, like when you're doing a lot of, like I said, I got another 20 or 30 slides, including specifically in relation to that. The Daily Worker did get letters from Americans who traveled to Ukraine in 1933. In fact, I can even just bring them up. Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of stuff here, so sorry. Let's see if I can find the letters. Here we go. So, series of letters basically rejecting both Harry Lang's reporting, but also the reporting of people like Fred Beal, who'd been in Kharkiv in 1933. So these reports are saying, there's a great tractor plan, didn't you? And here he's referring to what he calls the liar and pen prostitute Lang. See the baby carriages in the workers' apartments. These are the things I saw in Kharkov in 1932. Or another example, I myself was in the Ukraine at the time that Lang writes of, and I saw the people happily engaged in reconstructing the social order and not the wailing that Lang describes. Or a last example, in August 1933, I have been in Kiev visiting farms, not as a tourist, have spoken with the peasants and the factory workers. Everywhere there was plenty of food. I basically argue that this is kind of an example of see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. If you look at the work of the memory scholar Stanley Cohen, he calls this kind of, quote, not wanting to know, refusing to know, as this form of determined ignorance, a deliberate refusal to acknowledge. Although, as I argue, in this case, just to quote Fred Beal again, he's working at the Kharkiv tractor plant where these people are talking about. This is this prestige factory where there, in theory at least, was actually more food that wouldn't be available in the countryside, for instance. But he said, quote, it was common to see people drop dead from starvation. On no occasion that can I remember did I fail to see a death from starvation during my travels to the city. So what I argue is basically one of them's lying. Like there's not a lot of nuance here. Either there's people starving to death everywhere, or there's not. So I think it's a little more complicated than simple like denial of reality. I think that you either saw the corpses or you didn't, and I think there's a lot of reason to believe that Fred Beal was being a little more honest than these interlocutors writing into the Daily Worker. And maybe there were others who were a little more honest and they simply weren't published. I mean, the Daily Worker was literally controlled by the Communist Party, so they weren't necessarily in the business of printing criticism. So, in regards to your former question, it's a great question, and I do wonder if anyone's done any research into that very question, because again, there is this campaign of like memorial destruction in the occupied territories of Ukraine, where as soon as the Russians occupy any area, one of the things they're doing is they're literally rewriting the physical history of the place through the destruction, again, not only of Holodomor memorials, but what gives away the plot to me is they're also destroying these memorials to the victims of Stalinism in general. So there is this attempt to kind of, I don't know, rewrite history as part of this broader campaign of the destruction of Ukrainian identity in general. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. And we have questions in our chat, so you can read and answer, please.
Let me see if I can open that. I'm sorry. How can we find more information on Ria Kleiman? If you Google Ria Kleiman, Yars Balan, the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium has his article on her, which I would argue is the most as far as I'm aware, is the most extensive examination of her life. So if you just Google Ria Kleiman, Yars Balan, it'll come up. Planning on writing a book. Yeah. I did show my book at some point in this presentation. It's called Communist Propaganda in Pre-Cold War America.
Please show this slide with title.
Oh, geez. Let's see if I can.
Okay.
Slide 17, something like that. No, not that one. Yeah. So I do have a book that is coming out in 6 or so days that delves into a lot of detail about kind of these numerous propaganda campaigns, looking both at domestic campaigns in the US and also this sort of portrayal of the Soviet Union and American communist media, which I argue is basically, if you look at the Comintern archives, they're telling the Americans what to write. This was not an independent newspaper. So thank you for the question, Darlene. Oh, and there's a question for you, Oksana.
Yeah, so about record of this presentation, we did it and we'll post it on our YouTube channel. So I think that in several weeks you will be able to watch this lecture there too. Okay, maybe other questions, maybe some comments. So yeah, I have again, thanks for your lecture. And I have a last question about Duranty. You mentioned that he received a Pulitzer Award, right? So now no changes. Because I knew that there are some news that it's possible to change it. What do you know about it?
There have been various attempts. In 2003 is kind of when this controversy really emerged to the point where the New York Times addressed it. And the publisher of the paper at the time, I think Arthur Sulzberger, I'm not sure if that's his first name, but he addressed this and basically disavowed Duranty's reporting. And then again, after the full-scale invasion in 2022, there were a number of media reports about Duranty. I think the thing to point out about a figure like Duranty is that, in the context of the early 1930s, he's seen as this neutral, dispassionate, kind of calling balls and strikes type reporter. He's not seen as this radical pro-Soviet figure. So to me, that's something that's interesting to think about, the role that these supposedly kind of neutral, unbiased sources can play, and in the context of an ongoing genocide can play in kind of enabling these mass atrocities. And certainly in Duranty's case, he's being a lot more frank with British and American diplomats in private than he is in public.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we can finish. Henry, again, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you everyone who joined us today. And I would like to mention then that we'll have the next QX lecture in December, 1st of December, and then we'll have last reading club session in this year also in December. Everything will be posted on our social media pages, and we will send information about next lecture and next reading club session. We'll send this to our subscribers. Thank you so much again, and have a great day. Thank you. Bye.